Thank you, Gil, for this kind introduction. And thank you all for being here tonight. I know it's late and it's very cold outside, so I feel the cold too, because I just came back from Europe on Monday, where it was a little bit warmer, I have to say. And we actually just finished excavations in Dendera on December 20th. So what you're hearing tonight are actually the very fresh results and discoveries from our 2 seasons. We left here in at the beginning of October, did 5 weeks first in Edfu, and then actually 5 weeks at Dendera. So a pretty long season, and a lot of work that we were able to do. So the 2 sites, Dendera and Edfu, are actually linked via a religious ceremony. There is the goddess Hathor of the temple of Dendera, who comes to visit Horus of Edfu. And we know about these ceremonies from the very end of the Pharaonic, Ptolemaic, and Roman periods, because they have these amazing 2 temples. But these sites, these temples did not stand in isolation, and they were actually part of large provincial capitals. And you can see here on this map, I've mapped out for you the location of Edfu in southern Egypt. Right down here, it's about a 2 hours drive from south of Luxor. And then Dendera is to the north. It's about 45 minutes to the north of Luxor up here. And Dendera was the capital of the 6th Upper Egyptian province, or nome as we call it. And Edfu was the capital of the 2nd Upper Egyptian nome. So 2 important regional centers, and we have this unique opportunity to compare these 2 sites really from the origins, from over a long-term evolution until the Greco-Roman period. So really fantastic opportunity for new research. I will start with the site of Edfu, which you can see here on this image, with the prominent temple, the main tourist attraction in the background, and also the modern town. There's actually quite a large modern town around it. And then the settlement, it's a tell site, an artificial mound composed of superimposed settlement layers, where people have basically settled for several millennia. And the remains of this site are situated, is this dark brown mound on the western side of the temple. And you might notice that it looks pretty incomplete today. Unfortunately, settlements in Egypt have suffered a rather peculiar phenomenon, which is actually, as far as I know, mainly restricted to Egypt, that at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, modern Egyptians quarried away these sites in order to use the mud brick and the soil from these abandoned archaeological mounds as fertilizers for agriculture. And so a lot of sites have now completely disappeared. And in Edfu, we still have a large chunk of the site preserved, as you can see here, but we're also missing quite a few parts of it. So when we were starting to search for the origins of this town, you obviously start looking in what is actually known about the earliest textual evidence, for example. What do we know about previous research? And one of the few remains we knew about before we started our work are some predynastic objects, so that date to around 3,500 BC, before we have the Pharaonic period culture that came out from a cemetery site where the French and the Franco-Polish mission were excavating in the 1920s and 30s. So we do know that there are some origins going back to the Predynastic period, but then the city of Edfu is first mentioned properly in a relief. I hope you can see this okay. Yeah, the picture turned out there well. It's mentioning the king standing in front of the shrine of Edfu, which was depicted in the Djoser pyramid complex at Saqqara, dating to the 3rd dynasty. And then at the beginning of the 4th dynasty, there's a small pyramid in the vicinity of Edfu. That is a small step pyramid. It belongs to a series of very similar monuments that were erected in the vicinity of larger provincial towns dating to the early 4th dynasty. And this was actually an Oriental Institute project we did. It was sort of a rescue project between 2011 and 2012. So we do know that there should have been at least a first city, end of the third, beginning of the fourth dynasty. But trying to find archaeological evidence for this from the actual town site turned out to be much more complicated. So one area where we identified settlement remains dating to the 3rd millennium BC, so what we call the Old Kingdom, is actually located very close to the Ptolemaic temple and just west of the large pylon, which you can see here. So this settlement area called Zone 2 is where we've identified so far the accessible early 3rd millennium remains of the site. This came at a price, I have to say, because as you can see from these two pictures, we had to dig through a huge amount, several meters of unstratified debris, which was really tedious, I have to say. And at some point, we had to employ about 80 local workers because all has to be done manually. You can't really employ any machinery at sites like this. This debris came from, some of it was from these sebach diggers, the fertilizer diggers, who just discarded the ceramics and the stones they didn't want on the fields. And it really covered, as you can see here, a terrible mound, covered the whole area. And we could see from the sides where some of the remains were exposed that we were definitely looking at an Old Kingdom part of the town, so really important. We don't know much about the 3rd millennium BC in the south of Egypt because most of the activity has focused on the Memphite region where we have the pyramid sites. And very little is known about the provincial area. So from a research point of view, this was certainly something that we wanted to pursue despite the amount of work that had to be done. And by 2012, we pretty much reached an area that we could excavate. And now in 2017, this looks very different. You can imagine how much work has gotten into this. And last season, our main focus is a town quarter dating to the 5th dynasty. We were hoping we'd get earlier than this, but it looks like this particular part of the settlement here was founded in the 5th dynasty, towards the end even, directly on the natural sand. So it's obviously an extension from an earlier part that I'm now suspecting might be under the Ptolemaic temple and will never be able to reach. So one of the earlier walls and parts of buildings, in this case actually 2 large courtyards, also founded directly natural sand and bedrock. We can date now very securely to the reign of Djedkare Isesi, who was the penultimate ruler of the 5th dynasty. You see these rather well-built walls and large courtyard areas where we also found a lot of activity with various manufacturing processes. And the reason why I can date this so well now is because in one of the fireplaces we found a discarded clay ceiling that was stamped by a cylinder seal with the horse name of Djedkare Isesi. So in this case, it was really useful for us to find that piece of evidence. And another interesting find that actually comes from this find spot here are 2 fragments of a small, actually they're 2 different limestone statues. One looks like a seated scribe. You can see the seated position here, and then a standing figure with a back pillar. Also dating to the late 5th dynasty. Of course, we did not find the gold seal here, just in case you wonder. As I was telling earlier, it's not such a good idea on a site to find any kind of precious objects in the first place, because that usually attracts then a lot of looting later on, because the local people will think there's some real treasure to be found. So I'm actually very happy just to find the clay ceiling. That is beautiful information on its own. And in order to get to that, we also had to sieve through baskets and baskets full of dirt, where we found so many ceilings, broken clay ceilings, but they had no inscriptions on them. So in the Old Kingdom, there are only very few where you actually stamped it with a cylinder seal and so on. And after, I don't know how many baskets of sieving, and the students who are here tonight know the pain because they have been actively helping. You can see them up here. with the sieving process, very dusty and long. One of them, Emily Sarrazin, actually found the one with the royal name right in front of the camera when we had U Chicago Creative come and film our excavation. It was completely not planned, and she finds this specific piece while sieving while the camera is there. It was quite funny. So yeah, we had a film crew come out from the University of Chicago to actually film us and Chicago House, Ray Johnson, the Epigraphic Survey in Luxor, to show projects, U Chicago projects in Egypt, which was actually a fun experience. So now that we have some evidence for Djedkari Ezezi, the question is, what else do we know about this king and his connection to Edfu? And there's actually a really interesting one. So in the southwestern side of the Tell, there's actually a large cemetery dating to the Old and Middle Kingdom. So you have two main phases, late Old Kingdom, 6th Dynasty, and then again it gets reused in the later Middle Kingdom. And this specific cemetery contains a very important tomb, the tomb of Ezi, who was a local governor in the 6th Dynasty, who actually becomes venerated as a local saint after his lifetime, and especially during the Middle Kingdom and sang in the immediate period, so later, quite a bit later. And this high official, this local governor, left us a biography on his tomb, an inscription that actually tells us that he started his career under Djedkari Ezezi at the very end of the 5th Dynasty. So just to keep that in mind, that there is actually this quite interesting connection. I should mention that the cemetery was excavated by the French and Franco-Polish missions in the 20s and 30s, so we never actually dug there very much. And the finds from these tombs were sent to Warsaw, Paris, and Cairo. So back to our Zone 2 excavation. Apart from that, we very much established the foundation, the period of the date of the foundation of this part of the town. We continued excavations and found a very interesting and unusual building. And I can't right now even tell you what exactly the function is, because it is so unusual that if it wasn't found if I hadn't found it in the middle of a settlement, I would have immediately said this is a tomb. It looks, the architecture details, like very thick walls. You see this distinctive slope here. This is something that I would immediately associate with like a mastaba or a tomb structure. But here we are in the middle of the settlement, so very strange. And it was directly also founded on the natural sand, so it belongs to the first phase of when this part was settled. Here's another picture showing you a detailed shot of these massive walls. I mean, they're 2.5 meters thick, which immediately excludes any normal domestic building. And apart from the slope, another interesting feature is that it has its own perimeter wall, which you can see here, and I will show you in a moment, also quite massive, 1 meter wide. So this is a building of some considerable importance, and it's not of domestic character. That's all I can say for the moment. Of course, we're all fantasizing of, is this possibly a little chapel of some sort, a sanctuary, or an administrative building, but right now I don't have anything else but the architecture to go on. There are actually in this area two large monumental size buildings. So on the left, and I should probably show you that, on the left you can see the one with the sloping sides, then you have the red wall that is the perimeter wall, and then on the right you have another large building which is marked in green here. The length of the perimeter wall, as far as we could follow it, is 12.5 meters, which is pretty large, pretty long. And it turns at an angle here towards the south and extends for another 9 meters. So this is, again, something that you would associate with official structures of some sort, and not just a normal domestic installation. This is a view of the excavation area to the north. And again, you can see marked here, because it's easier to see like that, You can see the building with the thick sloping walls marked in blue, the perimeter wall, and we actually have part of this perimeter wall going northwards as well, but it's still covered by some later settlement remains. And then you have another large building just here on the in green towards the south. Then this is a view to the west, and again you see is the similar thing, just to illustrate the sheer size of these structures, with this perimeter wall very much delimiting the space in this part. And part of it, shown here with the red line, is actually going under this huge complex, which are 3 enclosure walls that were built in this area at a later time, towards the end of the Old Kingdom in the 6th dynasty. And these enclosures deliberately avoid the 2 structures I've just shown you. So they must have still been in the landscape and marked as important structures when, in the 6th dynasty, these enclosure walls were built. So going back to our strange enigmatic building with the sloping sides and very thick walls, we actually found the entrance of this structure already in 2014, but we hadn't excavated around it. We just had one side of it. And this is the original situation when we discovered the entrance, which you can see here. I will show you close up in a moment. And here are some of these extremely thick walls, more than 2 meters wide. And a later, just in case you wonder what this round thing is, this is a later grain silo that was domestic in function and built into this. The entrance is very unusual, simply because it's pretty well preserved, and we actually have the top of a door that was left open. So you see the wooden lintel, it's sagged a bit with all the weight on top, and then you have the part of the wooden door still being in an open position. And it also tells us that most of this building is actually still underneath this particular level. So we have really the top of the building. And now our idea is we need to really get down and find the corresponding floor levels, and hopefully some finds that actually go with it. We did excavate, of course, just in the entrance area a little bit. And we had a lot of debris dating to the 5th dynasty, from bread molds, a pot stand, beer jar, the usual kind of ceramics you would associate with a settlement. Not the most attractive kind of pieces of pottery, I have to say, but they tell us a lot. And then we did a test trench just in front of the entrance, where we just wanted to see how deep does this building, how deep, where can we find the corresponding floor level. And it's about 1.50 meters deep. And underneath it, we have immediately, again, the natural sand and bedrock, and almost no installations that date prior to this installation. So again, as I said, this is not something I would expect. It cannot be a domestic installation, but also confirmed non-domestic use is this small room. We are now a little bit further to the southeast of the site. This season we found a small room with a lot of storage jars that again hint towards an administrative building complex in the vicinity. And here's one of our workers excavating these large storage jars. And this picture is actually showing you might notice these strange little markers here. This is for a new method, a digital recording method we've been using for the first time this year. And these are specific markers that work like barcodes generated by a computer program that's called PhotoScan. And we were actually very lucky. We got a brief introduction into using this new software in September by Doug Inglis from Texas A&M University, who's been using this much more extensively. And in Egypt, this is not something people use a lot, but I will show you more in depth at the end of this talk how amazing it is to record archaeological remains in 3 dimensions. And this is basically showing you. It's actually pretty simple. You take a lot of pictures of a specific room or objects. In this case, the room with the storage jars, and the blue squares show you the camera position. So when I took the pictures there, just with a handheld normal camera, it took about 123 pictures in this case. And then it creates, through various processes, a mesh used with triangulation that starts to give you the three-dimensional aspect of all this. The program recognizes the pixels and basically puts it together, puts all the photos together and can create three-dimensional space and a three-dimensional surface. And then the end result is a 3D image of the actual room in color, which is, I mean, 10 times faster, even if the computer has its own processing time of several hours. Still more precise and a better way to record things than you imagine drawing by hand, where you will always be two-dimensional. And even using our total station, our equipment for mapping remains, we're never that fast, and we never get the three-dimensional aspect. But I will come back to this. Really amazing program. I'm a great fan now, and easy to use, not really difficult. The overall evolution of the occupation in this zone, just to sum up, we have first a large official administrative structure. I cannot exclude that we might even have an early phase of a sanctuary, but again, this needs to be confirmed in the future, in the next season, where we're getting to the levels that are actually connected to this, to these buildings. There was a destruction and abandonment that follows this particular phase of occupation, and then this is replaced by small domestic courtyards, very much domestic and very different, which are then later on replaced by domestic houses. So what this actually shows is a radical change in function of this settlement area. Here you can see one of the courtyards, which is being excavated by one of our graduate students, Emily Sarrazin, and you see immediately the aspect. It's not the same kind of quality of walls, it's not the same thickness, it's very different installations. And this comes after the abandonment of this building. Now I realize I forgot to tell you one important thing, and I need to go back a couple of slides. Hold on. If I go back to, just bear with me for a second. If I go back to this picture here, I should point out one thing is, in front of the entrance, here is where we have the thick building with the building with the thick walls. On the exterior of the building is in this area here, and we have a large open courtyard in this part. There are no structures, and we're hoping to reach the levels of this courtyard and maybe find some discarded objects that will tell us something about the function of this building, because most of the interior was actually situated to the west. And it did not really preserve because of the sebach digging, because of these people taking the fertilizer. So we can't really hope to excavate much of the interior, which makes it, unfortunately, really hard to see the function. But I'm hoping that on the outside there are some trash, discarded objects that will actually tell us something about the function. And then we do have, which you might have noticed as well when I was going through these pictures, there are large parts of the site that have been burned very heavily. That's why you get these red and black patches in the soil. So there's a huge destruction that follows at some point. And this is another hope we have, that in once we reach these destruction layers, which we couldn't really this year, again, we find some objects that were actually abandoned and tell us something more about the precise function. So let me go back to where I was. So in general, about the evolution of the settlement, we can now say that at the moment, the earliest remains we have are situated on the eastern side of the Tell, relatively close to the Ptolemaic Temple, and not surprisingly, the Ptolemaic Temple, which is the last form of a temple that dates back to the 3rd millennium, is so much larger and probably took away some of the oldest settlement remains. And certainly I don't see any other part that we still have preserved where we could access anything earlier than what we have there. Then we see a major expansion of the site, quite interesting, during the very end of the Old Kingdom, the First Intermediate period, when we have, historically speaking, a time where Egypt falls apart, so the centralized government falls apart, and we have several power centers in Egypt, especially Upper Egypt. And usually this time period, not only is it not very well known because it's a pretty short time considering the whole of Pharaonic period history, but it's also usually associated with a major economic crisis. Now, in Upper Egypt, and Edfu is only one example, it seems like at this specific time, the towns were expanding rapidly. And this can be very easily demonstrated here at Edfu, where we have a major set of enclosure walls dating to this period that were first constructed on the northern and western side of the Tell. And this season, as you can see, some of these are actually three wall phases here, massive enclosure walls. In the total thickness is 6 meters. We actually cleaned with our amazing team of Egyptian workers. We cleaned 70 meters of wall. There was a lot of cleaning to do on the top. There was a lot of debris that was still covering it. 70 meters in 1 week. So the guys were working extremely hard. We have one of the foremen in charge. He was like, I have 20 guys, but I make them work like 50. So he was all the time pushing everybody to, yeah, fantastic results. So now we can actually study the architecture. And we also used the same program, the photoscan program, taking, of course, more than 100 pictures of the wall in order to actually make a three-dimensional reconstruction. Because you imagine drawing any of this by hand, impossible. It would be a nightmare. We also had a funny incident with this cherry picker, because at one moment we noticed there was this truck going up and down on the street repairing the street lights, and we thought, oh, maybe we can hire these guys for half an hour to take some pictures of this wall. And yeah, they were very happy. They thought it was too funny that we needed to use their cherry picker. And I didn't go up there. I have to say I wasn't particularly trusting the security of this thing. But the picture, this is actually the picture taken here from the truck. But it worked out pretty well. Yeah, and a few seasons back, in order to even understand what this walling system was about, we found some of the settlement remains that were still sort of built against the first phase of walling, dating to the first intermediate period. So we have a really good idea of what the chronology of all this is. And then in the Middle Kingdom, there was the last phase of wall fortification here. But what I really want to point out is that the maximum expansion at Tell Edfu of the settlement to the north and west happened during this particular time, so around 2100 BC, and it stayed exactly the same until the Greco-Roman period, Byzantine period. The whole site never expanded any further in these two directions, which I actually, and again, we need to do more research on this, I relate to the fact that you couldn't go outside this zone because the Nile flood would catch up with you. There was no way you could settle further into, this is actually a modern cemetery these days, and you can even see there the ground drops dramatically. So another little detail we found out about recently is when the Ptolemaic temple was actually, it was part of a groundwater lowering project where they dug a trench around the temple in order to make sure that the groundwater is not affecting the stone of the temple. In order to understand, to do these trenches and set the pumps right, there was a geological survey that was done, and they found out that the temple is built on a cliff. It's actually sandstone outcrop, a cliff that's pretty steep on the eastern part. And we'll do some more work on all this in the future of trying to figure out where was the Nile at the time, and is it possible that Edfu was an island at some point, which I think is a pretty strong possibility. And that would actually also really explain why the settlement was not really expanding so much west and north as well. And just to illustrate this a bit more clearly, here you have the walling system roughly sketched in the first intermediate period. And these are the walls, the settlement walls we have for the 5th and 6th dynasties. And so basically we can say the settlement develops from the core somewhere in this area, north and westwards. I will now move on to Dendera. Dendera, again, from the actual status, it's also an urban center, provincial capital, but situated in a very different landscape. So we are on the desert edge, and there are not the same restrictions as at Edfu in order to be safe from the floodwaters. Also, in Edfu, we have a pretty good idea where the Nile was at the time, while in Dendera, we don't. And one of the major research questions we're asking is, and we need to figure out with the geomorphologist, how did the Nile move from the site and how did it affect the settlement? Because surely the Nile wasn't that far away at the time when there was a major town there. But it's obviously, very different setting. This picture, where you can see the main tourist attraction, again, the Temple of Hathor, dating to the Roman period. And there's just a smaller temple of the Ptolemaic period dedicated to the goddess Isis. And then you have this enormous perimeter wall marking the sacred precinct. This is what most people remember when they think about Dendera, because this is the main tourist attraction. This photo was taken with a drone, or I should call it better, a flying camera, which is less conspicuous, because it's not easy to use. I mean, you've heard about the use of drones for various Oriental Institute projects, which is normal in most countries, but in Egypt it's a big deal to get military permission. You need to get a special permission from the military to use such equipment. And interestingly, in Edfu, we didn't get the permission, which wasn't really so much of a problem because the area is much smaller. But in Dendera, we did. And so we were able to actually take some amazing footage and photographs from up the air. And we don't know, I can't tell you whether next year we'll get the permission again. It's one of those things, it's really lucky that it worked out. Ray Johnson with the epigraphic survey also got the permission, but he actually asked for using a flying camera. So we keep joking, it's a better way to never use the word drone. It sets off all the alarms. So Dendera being situated just north of Luxor in this area where the Nile is forming a large curve, and it's the only place in the Nile Valley where the Nile is flows from east and west. Hold on. Oop. And it's really difficult. Usually, when you ask any Egyptians today where north is, they always go with the river. So in Dendera, the river doesn't actually show you where north is, but it shows you where, no, I need to get this right, where west is. So there's a total confusion of the cardinal points in the site, because the Nile is not doing what it usually does. The region of Dendera goes back, I mean, there are lots of really important pre-dynastic sites in the wider region, like Nagada, Koptos, Abydos, and not far from Dendera, there's also a Middle Paleolithic site where the oldest body ever found in Egypt was discovered, and you can see the dates, 55,000 to 80,000 BC, so really, really early. So in Dendera, we can for sure date back the first occupation to the Nagada, to CD periods, which is around 3,500 BC, what we call the Predynastic. I should also, before I go into further details, point out to you that even though we very much know about the temple, here you have the temple enclosure, the temple in the center, Temple of Hathor, and the enclosure wall, the site is much larger than that. The archaeological site actually extends massively into the desert, which is this huge area here, which is actually a cemetery, and then part of the ancient town moved to the east. And there's another completely unexcavated temple structure in this area here. So the town was at some point sandwiched between two major sanctuaries. And the total size of this is about, it's a bit more than 20 hectares. So it's a huge archaeological area. And here you can see maybe better on this map the large cemetery where We have some tombs dating to the early dynastic period, so dynasties 1 and 2. They were discovered in 1917 by Clarence Fisher, who excavated part of the site after Petrie, who also excavated the early cemetery at Dendera. And then we found during our first season last year some occupation for even earlier period, the Predynastic Nagada II period, close to the Temple of Hathor, inside the Temenos wall. So the 2015 excavation area, we mainly focused inside the Temenos wall, very close to the Roman and Ptolemaic temples in this specific area here. And actually, Greg, who can't be here tonight and sends his apologies, is now going back to this specific area to continue some of the work there, which we didn't finish last year. The idea was to try to understand whether we have any evidence for an earlier sanctuary, because we know there should have been earlier temples in this area, but impossible to know exactly where. And in the search for a Middle Kingdom temple, which has nothing to do really with what we found in the end, we found pottery sherds that are dating to the Predynastic, so Nagada II CD, which was actually, so we have, you can see this, you can see the stone foundations of the Ptolemaic temple here. Underneath it, there was some mud brick walls that were Middle Kingdom, and then there was a big gap in occupation, and you have the Predynastic. So there's nothing between the Middle Kingdom and the Predynastic, which is really interesting. Again, nicely demonstrated also with the finds in an area slightly to the east, where we did another test trench. And again, we have a lot of evidence for a Predynastic settlement here. We have the flint tools, we have the ceramics, and we also have these curious objects that are called fire dogs, which are actually clay supports for large vats for beer brewing. And they have this, I mean, we only found like not very well preserved fragments, which you can see here, but these are better preserved examples from the site of Hierakonpolis, an important Predynastic site further south in Egypt. And this is a reconstruction of how these fire dogs would support large vats for beer brewing. So we have those, no problem. And then the early dynastic period, dynasties 1 and 2, were found mainly in the form of pottery during the survey in the surrounding area here. You see these sort of mound-like structures, like holes and lots of pottery sherds. This is, again, a lot of debris from the Sabah digging. They have been at almost every site and settlement site in Egypt, and left us with these holes and all these discarded pot sherds completely mixed up. But within these heaps, we did actually find pieces of wine jars typical for this period, large bread molds, and also some tools for making stone vessels, and a broken hippo figurine that's pretty much broken, but we have actually much better preserved example in the Oriental Institute that also comes from Dendera. And yeah, I can't really show you. You just have to believe me that this is a hippo. I know it's hard. And there's another piece of this, this fire dog. So we then moved on to the next phase, which is the Old Kingdom settlement, and to see whether we can find anything about in connection with the Hathor and Isis sanctuaries. And here marked in red are various areas of exposures that have Old Kingdom remains, and you can see there's quite a bit there. And quite accessible, actually more easily accessible than in Edfu. The earliest textual sources referring to Dendera as a city, as a known capital, date to the early 4th dynasty, so similar time frame as we have in Edfu. Here's a stela from a king's son called Neter-Aperev, who was a priest at the Bent Pyramid at Dashur. And he had a title being an overseer of commissions of the nomes or provinces of Koptos, Hu, and Dendera. And the city of Dendera is specifically mentioned. And what I've shown you from Edfu, we also have this moment with the small step pyramid dating also to the early 4th dynasty, where this pyramid would not be there if there wasn't a regional center somewhere in the vicinity. And then another piece that was discovered dating to the end of the Old Kingdom is the statuette of Pepi I that was found in the 1950s and 60s. So that was basically almost everything that was known about early Dendera before we started the fieldwork there. So we were looking for an Old Kingdom occupation and a possible sanctuary underneath a later enclosure wall. And you can see this massive wall system here. Also, always been in the landscape at the temple, never studied or investigated. People just like, as long as it's mud brick, a lot of times completely ignored by archaeologists who really went for the stone architecture only. But if you want to understand a site like Dendera, you have to go beyond that and try to understand the context of these temples. So we have in the same area, close to the Isis and Hathor temples, we have settlement activity of the early Old Kingdom, 3rd dynasty, and very surprisingly, we found a pig pen, of all things. And you can see this sort of whitish area where there was actually a fence around it, and these little prints here are actually the prints of the feet, and there's a close-up here. So there's no question that this was a pig pen. And the pigs were actually an important animal for the ancient Egyptians because it's an easy protein source. Pigs are easily kept, they don't need a lot of space, and they eat almost everything. So it's a very efficient way of, very efficient meat source. And this would point very much not to sanctuary, but to part of a domestic installation in this area. But by the early 4th dynasty, we did find a larger enclosure wall here, which is obviously broken up, but it's actually, as you can see probably best from this image, it's a corner. So you have a wall face here and a face here, and it would have been the southeastern corner of a large enclosure wall. And this kind of wall would very much fit with the perimeter wall of an early sanctuary. Then we found some more evidence for Old Kingdom activity just on the exterior to the east of this massive Middle Kingdom wall, which is the one marked here in red. And on the exterior, we had also, you can see the Middle Kingdom wall right up here, beautifully preserved. And then in this sort of heap of debris, once we cleared it away, we actually found evidence for the Old Kingdom very much, beautifully stratified. So you have from the natural sand deposit, early 4th dynasty layers, 6th into the 6th dynasty, and then the Middle Kingdom wall is directly cut into these earlier layers, and we have the foundation trench to prove that. So some of the objects that came out, again, not that exciting, but very informative. A lot of beer jars, a lot of bread molds, so bread and beer production, which actually were also used a lot for the upkeep of the offerings. So a temple had a large, usually a large economic part attached to it, where food was produced for the daily offerings. And we found such a huge amount of these beer jars and bread molds that this would fit pretty nicely. Plus, this peculiar thing, this is actually a mud jar stopper, so something that would close a large storage jar. And on one of them, we have an imprint, again, of a cylinder seal of a royal Sarah, which gives you the horse name of a king. And unfortunately, this piece is extremely fragile and not very well preserved, and it was impossible to actually read the king's name. According to the ceramics, it should be some ruler in the 4th dynasty, but I mean, you can see it's impossible to take a good picture, and it's far too fragile to actually, it's not really well preserved. But again, who knows, maybe we find more of this stuff. Then moving on to the Middle Kingdom, we actually have this, what was known before the excavations. We have a chapel of Mentuhotep II, the king who reunified the country during the 11th dynasty. And that chapel was situated sort of in this area here to the west of the temple. Our excavation area, just to remind you, was here, so it's on the other side, and there was a small chapel of the time of Mentuhotep II. And then we also know of a larger temple for which we have several limestone blocks naming King Amenemhat I, the founder of the 12th dynasty. And quite a few of these blocks of Amenemhat I were actually reused in the foundations of this Ptolemaic Isis temple, which makes you wonder whether one of the earliest structures was actually situated underneath the later Isis temple. And that's where we also continued the excavations. And there was always this curious mud brick wall just in front of the much later temple structure. And we were able, with the help of the pottery, here you can actually see the layout, we were able, with floor levels and ceramics, to date this to the Middle Kingdom. So there's certainly a Middle Kingdom phase here. And that belongs to this particular sanctuary. And this is the large enclosure wall I mentioned earlier, and you can see immediately the different orientation from the Roman temple, very different, and has nothing to do with it, and dates also to the Middle Kingdom. And it actually, the Old Kingdom wall, where I said we had the corner, the Old Kingdom enclosure was situated right here, and the Middle Kingdom one is extending much further southwards, suddenly enlarging the area. And that would fit very well with what we have in front of the Isis temple, that suddenly there was this sanctuary that was put into place further south. Again, you can see it from this picture taken with the drone, very different alignment of the Middle Kingdom wall to the Hathor temple, and it usually gives you a very good indication that these two monuments don't go together at all. And then here's the foundation trench. I've marked this in yellow, where it's cutting right through the late Old Kingdom settlement layers. So we do have now some evidence for the earliest sanctuaries, just in form of perimeter walls, terminus walls, but at least it's giving us a pretty good idea that we also had a major activity of these two periods in the very close to the Hathor, Roman Hathor and Ptolemaic Isis temple. So this year, our focus was quite different. We left the temple enclosure wall and really ventured on the outside, on the exterior. And this is a huge area just to the east of the temple, as I was saying earlier, sandwiched in between an unexcavated temple complex to the east and the main well-known temple complex. And another pretty spectacular view, and much better than anything else I can think of to explain what happened here, is this view taken with our flying camera. You see the main temple area in the background, and then you see our excavation area of the ancient town right here. And basically what we can say now is that from the core of the Old Kingdom settlement being close to the temple, which makes a lot of sense, the site was gradually expanding in the third millennium to the east. And it was using this probably higher-lying sand formation. Again, we have a geomorphologist who's going to look at this more closely. What made people expand this town in this direction specifically? Was it because there's another temple structure in the vicinity, or is it simply an advantageous part to settle? Also interesting, you might see the different forms of vegetation on each side. So here you have a sort of grass-like vegetation, while this part, this green stuff, is called camel thorn, or the modern Egyptians call it shuk. It's something really annoying. It's very spiky, and if you don't have good pants, it actually really, not very comfortable to walk through, and especially some of our total station points are in this area. Very annoying type of vegetation that can only be eaten by camels. I think that's why they call it camel thorn. And right in the middle is the archaeological area, and you can see also there's no particular protection here. The Antiquities Organization very much knows that this is an ancient site and it's forbidden to build on it, but there's no formal, there's no enclosure or marking of this specific area. So the focus was this excavating this large settlement quarter, which mainly dates to the first intermediate period. So here again, we have exactly the same phenomenon at Edfu, that at the end of the 6th dynasty, the town rapidly, actually fairly rapidly, expands considerably, in this case to the east. And we are able to look at this specific period, which is, as I mentioned earlier, not very well known. And this is the only site in Egypt where you can excavate on a large extension a town dating to around 2100 BC. The size of the area is 65 by 50 meters. And because it's so different from Edfu, where we have a tell with a lot of settlement remains sitting on top of each other, here we can actually spread out and excavate on a much larger scale, because we are only dealing with 4 occupational phases. Very different and actually a little bit easier to dig too. The red area, this is actually where I started part of my archaeological career in 2001 and 2, excavating with a French team who were just focusing on one building. And the director at the time was looking for a Greco-Roman settlement and absolutely hated the idea that he found a first intermediate period one. He was not happy at all and abandoned this very quickly. But this site for me was always one of the most interesting settlements to excavate. And as you can see from the previous picture, if I just go back one, there is quite a bit of settlement still to explore, and we've just taken the easternmost part. I mean, this area here all awaits further exploration. Of course, there's some sabah digging there too, so you do have to deal with some holes in destruction, but, well, we're used to it by now. Then from the aerial view, which is again beautiful with this drone, we were able to discern already like the main streets, and you can see it's pretty well organized, but I would not go as far as saying this is a pre-planned settlement. Just because you have streets in right angles doesn't mean that there was a specific pre-fabricated plan to this. We also noticed that the houses are large, they can spread out, they don't have these restrictions like in Edfu being in a landscape where you don't have a lot of space. Here they were spreading out and building large courtyards, large houses, and nothing looks like these guys had to deal with an economic crisis. This is the excavation in progress. We had about 20 Egyptian workers and specialists who are actually fully trained archaeologists working with us at the site. And and then we have 2 major phases, one dating to the first intermediate period and a second one to the early Middle Kingdom, after which this part of the site is abandoned, which is also strange. And here's a reconstruction of one of the houses. Again, with our beautiful photo scan program, you get a 3D model, and you can see immediately the sort of organization with like 2 larger rooms, and in the center there's always a staircase here, marked here. I've not seen that many staircases in a town before. It was just amazing. Almost every house there has a staircase. And you have to get used to excavating that too, because it looks quite different from the usual rooms you look at. And these staircases probably led to a roof. We don't think it was necessarily an upper floor because the walls are not that thick and might have not supported a second floor. But using the roof space is something that's quite typical for houses like this. And some of the objects, like, for example, the small animal figurine in clay, we couldn't quite figure out what kind of animal. It wasn't too specific, some 4-legged creature. And a little slate palette used for grinding pigment. And then also administrative activity, evidence for administrative activity. Here we have a pretty rare example for faience cylinder seal that was found trapped in its original between 2 floors, if I remember correctly. And you can see this is like a print of the cylinder seal. Pretty much figurative motifs, not really anything that looks very text-like, but again, this has not been studied properly. And then on the other side here, to the right, we have a lot of broken clay ceilings dating to the early Middle Kingdom. Again, testing for administrative activity. You see some of the back types have imprints of basketry, wood, and so on, really showing what kind of containers they were attached to. And then on the other side, you get these little imprints showing figurative motifs from the seals that used to stamp these. So this is basically where we are at right now at both sites. And there's obviously quite a lot of more work to be done. And I just want to spend the last few minutes in giving you an insight into the new approaches and technology we've been using at both of these excavations with the support of this amazing FIRE program, Fund for Innovation of Research in Egypt. Isn't that fitting as a name? And which includes also site management and also training of Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities inspectors. So at Edfu, we were helping out the local inspector with installing new lights in the main temple, which, to be honest, is not really our main task, since we are actually excavating the tell and not the temple. But given the financial crises, all the ministries facing and the antiquities, the upkeep of antiquities in general, the upkeep of sites, we were happy to help out. Actually, Chicago House helped us as well a bit with getting some of the lights. And by the end of it, the main rooms in the temple have a new lighting system, which made everybody really happy, and also the tourists. And there's actually an increase in tourists these days, which is wonderful to see. This is the training of several inspectors from the Ministry of Antiquity inspectorates, and we had actually also had two from the French Institute training program. And these guys were absolutely amazing to work with, and received some very in-depth archaeological training. And we have this guy here, Abdel Rahman, and female inspector Heba. They were our two trainees. And this guy in the middle is actually the inspector for the temple area, and he was so eager to come and dig as well that he just joined us, which was quite nice. And then these are the two French Institute inspectors learning how to draw ceramics. So we train them a bit in every aspect of archaeological fieldwork. At Edfu, at the end of the season, I was invited to give a lecture about our work, because even though they see the work in progress, they never really get the bigger picture of what we actually do with the results we get. And I thought it was a brilliant idea, and I had one of the more senior inspectors, Ramadan, helping me to translate everything into Arabic, so we could make sure that everybody was really understanding of and could understand my lecture, because the English is not always amazing, especially not in a very provincial area like Edfu. And we used the Edfu Visitor Center, where somebody, I don't know who, has donated these amazing TV screens, flat screens. And the only problem was to find an HDMI connection for my computer, which even in Edfu you can do if necessary. But it was really, it was pretty amazing, and the response also from the inspectors to just see a bit more about the big picture of these excavations. Then we have a new program for the analysis of faunal remains. One of our graduate students, Sasha Rohrad, looking into writing her dissertation on faunal remains from Edfu and Dendera. And you can see her in one of the pictures holding a hippo bone, which is a pretty large bone, as you can see in the scale. We have a lot of hippopotamus in Edfu, which is pretty unusual and not really found at other sites in the same quantity. And then this is where she's working in the El Cab magazine. That's where we store most of our objects after the excavation, where she's analyzing. I think this is from a dog burial. Then geomorphology. So we started a geomorphological study, because in order to understand these settlements, you also need to understand the evolution of the local landscape. And here we have Tim Ralph from the Macquarie University, Sydney, doing drill cores with the help of a couple of Egyptian workers, doing drill cores at Dendera, trying to understand what is the formation of this sand area where the settlement was founded on. And then I already mentioned to you the DJI Phantom 4 drone or flying camera that we've been using for aerial photography, and people loved it. I mean, it was really something that the local inspectors are extremely supportive of, and most amazing results And actually, some of these pictures we were able also to use in PhotoScan. This is a model of the whole excavation area we did of the settlement site, showing you the blue squares again show you the position of the camera that's actually calculated by this program from the pixels. And we can create 3D models and orthophotography. Orthophotography means we can have images that are not distorted anymore through the lens of the camera, and we can actually draw on it and make real plans and take measurements. It's an amazing tool and so much faster than doing this by hand, and actually really accurate. For this huge area where we are at 65 by 50 meters, I think it has an accuracy up to 2 centimeters, which honestly, given that this is all mud brick anyway, is perfectly wonderful. So once this program puts together all the pixels and aligns the pictures, it actually creates this mesh I showed you earlier, which is basically the 3D aspect of the image, but you don't yet have the colors. I mean, you see this just gray, gray mass, but you can already see the contours. And then the last step is adding the color from the images, fitting it onto this mesh, and it's the final product is a 3D model of the entire excavation zone, which is something you can use immediately for analysis, for understanding the layout of the houses, the organization of the specific quarter. And then this is what I mentioned earlier, an orthophoto where you can draw on and you can create some of your plans with, because you don't have this camera distortion anymore. So very useful for drawing up the architectural plan. And then a last nice little addition is that this program also creates digital elevation models. And the red, yellow parts are the higher lying areas, and the green, blue ones are lower. And what we didn't know until we had this is that this settlement seems to be on a slope. It's really something that came out through this computer program more than you would necessarily realize when you're on the ground. But you can see very nicely here, this is towards the east. It seems to go much deeper than the area sorry, this is the west. You see, I hate orientation in Dendera. West, east. And then the last thing we've been using for the first time is actually a 3D scanner, a handheld scanner. We received some generous training by Josh Cannon, another graduate student here at the university who has been using this for his PhD dissertation. And he taught us how to use this specific handheld scanner. I have to say I was pretty pleased that it looks like an iron when you go through customs, in case somebody has a question. Because it's real tricky to get materials like this through customs, I can tell you. It's always a matter of some anxiety. You can see the actual object is a clay figurine here, sitting on a turntable. And one of our recent PhDs, Catherine Bandy, is actually using this scanner in the El Cab magazine, and she's slowly turning the figurine. You have the scanner set in fixed position, and then on the computer you can see the partially scanned figurine. I can't actually show you the real models because the computer with all the data is with Greg in Egypt right now, and he needs this rather powerful. We only have one powerful PC that can do this kind of program. Now, the possibilities with the 3D scanning, again, it saves a lot of time, and it's extremely precise, up to millimeter accuracy. And there's a possibility for 3D printing, which means you could actually get replicas of the objects. And we were thinking that maybe in the future it would be possible to do a small exhibit here at the Oriental Institute of objects from these excavations for the first time here in Chicago. And since we can't bring any objects ever back from Egypt, this would be a very nice way of showing a little bit more of the actual pieces we find from the excavation. So this is something we're hoping to develop in the future. So I'm sure you're all ready for a drink. I am, at least. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer questions. And I want to thank specifically the Oriental Institute and its numerous donors for their ongoing support. This work would not be possible without the generous support. Thank you.